Good evening, good afternoon, or good morning, depends on where you are. My name is Neville, a young China watcher of Hong Kong. Thanks for joining the event by Young China Watcher Hong Kong on the latest book by Professor Jonathan Kaufman, The Last Kings of Shanghai, the rival Jewish dynasties that helped create modern China. The presentation will be followed by a Q&A session and discussion towards the end. So please note that the event is being recorded. And as we go along, please feel free to leave questions in the chat. So it will be a message to our host or co-host, and the questions will be addressed towards the end. Just to make sure, if you don't know who are we, like YCW, so YCW is a dynamic group of China-focused young professionals through regular roundtables and talks with senior figures in the China academic, policy, and business communities. It sort of provides a chance for engaged individuals to interact and discuss the most pressing issues emerging from China today. And we have almost 5,000 members present in 10 cities. So for Professor Kaufman, a Pulitzer Prize winner, reporter, editor, and author, joined Northeastern University in 2015 as professor and director in the School of Journalism. Prior to joining Northeastern, he held senior positions at Bloomberg News, the Wall Street Journal, and the Boston Globe. He now lives in Hong Kong. He was the Beijing bureau chief based in China before. Thank you for coming, Professor. And thank you everyone for joining this evening. The time is yours, Professor.
Great. Thank you very much, Neville. And thank you everybody for joining us. As Neville said, I've been a longtime journalist and lived in Hong Kong for many years, was the China bureau chief for the Wall Street Journal, oversaw China coverage for Bloomberg News. And so I've been tied very much to Hong Kong, Shanghai, Beijing, and my family has joined me. So Hong Kong's always had a special place in my heart, and so has China. So I wanted to talk today a little bit about my book and about the role of Jews in the development of China, which may seem an unusual topic. I think when most Westerners look at Chinese history, including myself, they know the simple story, which is that China was once a great empire and a great world power. It was invaded and carved up by the Western powers, first the British, then the other European countries, the United States, and of course the Japanese. And then in 1949, it was liberated by the Communist Party. And today, following the reform and opening of 1978, it's reemerged as a great power again. But the fact is that China's history is a lot more complicated than that, just as American history and British history is more complicated. And what I've been looking at and what I look at in my book is the role that foreigners played in China's history, especially from the 1820s to the current day. And I look particularly at two Jewish families, the Sassoons and the Kadoories. Now, for those of you who live in Hong Kong, the Kadoorie name is probably quite familiar. The Kadoories today are the richest Western family in Hong Kong. They're actually the richest Western family living in China. They're worth more than 13 billion US dollars. They own China Light and Power. They own the Peninsula Hotel chain. They built the Peak Tram. They helped build the first Cross Harbor Tunnel. Some of you may have visited the Kadoorie Agricultural Aid Association or the Repulse Bay Hotel near Stanley. These are all built by the Kadoorie family. So is the Daya Bay Nuclear Power Station, which supplies Hong Kong and Guangdong with much of its electricity. Although it's probably hard to imagine the Sassoon family, the other family I write about, when they were at their height of their power in Shanghai, were even richer than the Kadoories. They actually, in the 1930s, were one of the richest families in the world. They were headquartered in Shanghai in the Peace Hotel, which today stands along the Waitan. And the Peace Hotel was once the fanciest hotel in all of Asia. Celebrities from around the world would visit and stay there. It was actually across the street from another hotel owned by the Kadoories, and that's where Chiang Kai-shek married Madame Sun Yat-sen, connecting these two great Chinese families. In Shanghai, the Kadoories lived in what is now the Children's Palace. Um, that palace was actually a 43-room home for just three people. Just three members of the Kadoorie family lived there in 43 rooms with about 44 servants. And also in Shanghai, which you may have visited or heard about, up in the Hangqiu neighborhood, 18,000 Jewish refugees fled there during World War II and found safety during World War II from the Nazis. So it's this history of Jews in China and the role of these families, especially in Hong Kong and Shanghai, that I decided to write about and research. And I think one way to think about this is that, certainly for all of you who are familiar with China, but also for foreigners like myself, Hong Kong and Shanghai always feel different than the rest of China. The architecture is different, the people seem different, the history is different. And I think that's because of the influence of these families and of the foreigners who lived and helped really create both of these cities. Um, I want to talk a little bit first about Jews. Today Jews obviously are quite wealthy. They are influential in business, in media, even in politics, in the US, in Great Britain, certainly in Israel. But that hasn't always been true. Jews spent much of their history really fleeing from place to place. They would settle in countries, they would become wealthy and powerful, but then the politicians would turn against them and they would have to leave and go somewhere else. In some ways, I think it was like the overseas Chinese um, in Southeast Asia, who always had great commercial success, but often faced discrimination in these countries and were even attacked. And obviously, we're seeing some of that in the United States now. And so I think that when Chinese and Jews look at each other and think about each other, they realize they have some common experiences. So this book starts 2,000 years ago, a long time ago, when Jews were in Jerusalem, in the Middle East. And the Persians and others kept on invading Jerusalem and conquering the Jews. And they actually kidnapped the Jews at one point and brought them to Baghdad, what is now Baghdad in Iraq. And this story is actually told in the Bible, in the Bible, and it's true. So these Jews were kind of yanked out of their homes in Jerusalem, forced to settle in Baghdad, but they became very successful. They became leading in businesses. There were a lot of great scholars that came out of this period. And in fact, the Jews became so prominent in Baghdad that the ruler of Baghdad would turn to them for financial advice. They were almost like the Chancellor of the Exchequer or the Treasury Secretary, where they would advise the various rulers of Baghdad how to collect taxes and how to expand their trade. Um, and in fact, the Jews were so influential that the rulers of Baghdad would name one family, kind of the leader of the Jewish community, and would meet with that person regularly. And whenever the leader of the family was brought to meet the pasha or the king, he would be carried through the streets of Baghdad in a sedan chair. And everybody, whether they were Jewish or not, would bow their head respectfully because this was a person of great honor. This family was the Sassoon family, and the person who was had this very influential position was David Sassoon. And in the 1820s, David Sassoon was prepared to take over his family dynasty. They were one of the richest families in Baghdad. They had trading routes throughout the Middle East. They were very successful, very influential. But as I said, what has often happened in Jewish history is that people turn against the Jews. And in Baghdad, they not only turned against the Jews, they began to kidnap them and hold them for ransom. And so David Sassoon's father went down to the jail after his son had been kidnapped and arrested by the government, freed him, and then quickly sent him out of Baghdad to safety. And David Sassoon ended up in India in the 1820s, 1830s. And he arrived in India just as the British were arriving in India and turning India into a colony. Eventually, David Sassoon got the rest of his family out of Baghdad, and he was a very smart businessman, and he quickly made a great deal of money. And the way you could make a great deal of money very quickly at this time was through the opium trade. Opium was grown in India, and it was then smuggled into China. And the kind of profits you could make were enormous. On like one shipment of opium, you could make a profit in today's dollars of several hundred thousand US dollars. So David Sassoon began to get involved in the opium trade along with a lot of other British traders. But something that's important to remember as I kind of tell this story is that even though David Sassoon worked with the British companies, even though he became a British citizen, even though he swore his loyalty to Queen Victoria and the British, because he was Jewish, the British always viewed him as an outsider. They may have done business with him, but they never kind of fully trusted him. And what that meant was that for David Sassoon, he had to work with other kinds of businessmen. And this becomes important because it sort of, in a way, forced him to be more creative and more innovative. After the Opium War, the two Opium Wars in the 1840s, David Sassoon saw an enormous opportunity in the opium trade in China. And he basically outfoxed all his British rivals. So, for example, the Jardines and the other British companies that were dealing in opium relied on sailing ships to get the opium from India to Hong Kong and to Shanghai. But David Sassoon decided to invest in this new technology called steamships, which were much faster and allowed him to get his opium to China on a much faster timetable. He also invested in the telegraph. And so you probably know if you're in Hong Kong, there's a spot in Hong Kong called Jardine's Lookout. And this was where Jardines would put various employees to look out over the harbor. So when their ships carrying opium came in, they could signal them whether it was a good time to come or not, or they could alert people that the opium shipments were coming in. Well, David Sassoon looked at this and thought, I can be much more efficient if I invest in the telegraph. And he would be in India with a telegraph. He sent his sons, he had 8 sons, he sent his sons all across China, and they would communicate via telegraph. And that allowed them to actually beat out Jardines. And within a matter of 10 or 20 years, the Sassoons completely dominated the opium trade. They drove Jardine out of the opium business and controlled it themselves. And this is, I think, an issue that, needs to be talked about because, when I talk to the Sassoon family today, they say, well, opium was legal. The British government taxed it. The Sassoons actually became very influential in London because they would give the Prince of Wales and the King kind of tips to buy opium so they could make money. It was very much an open trade. But the fact is that the Sassoons knew how dangerous opium was. We know, of course, that probably 10 to 12% of Chinese citizens were addicted to opium at this point. It was creating huge problems, weakening the Chinese government, causing all sorts of pain for so many Chinese families. The Sassoons themselves never used opium. But they knew how dangerous it was because many of their own employees suffered from opium addiction. When I was reading the documents of the Sassoon family, they often have to fire people because they've become addicted to opium. And there were, of course, many anti-opium crusades during this time, not only in China, but in Britain and the United States, people who saw how dangerous opium was and were trying to get it banned. And the Sassoons fought vigorously against it. They were very influential in London. They kept on blocking any effort to limit the opium trade. And so, from a moral point of view, it's important to recognize that, these families were engaged in a trade that caused enormous suffering for many Chinese and really wasn't banned until 1913, 1914. And this was the basis of the Sassoon fortune. At the same time that the Sassoons are becoming so influential and rich from the opium trade in China, the Kadoories also enter the scene. One thing, and this is again something that I think perhaps Chinese and Jews share, is that when the Sassoons were building up their businesses in China, as I said, they had 8 sons, and these sons were sent to China to kind of run the business. But as they expanded, they needed more and more people to work for them. And the people they decided to hire were other Jewish people. So they would go send word back to Baghdad and tell the Jews in Baghdad that if you're not feeling safe in Baghdad, there's great opportunities working for the Sassoons in China. And so families, Jewish families in Baghdad, would send their sons, they were almost always sons, to the Sassoons. And the Sassoons set up schools where they could educate these Jewish refugees who were coming to work for them. They set up synagogues where they could worship. They set up hospitals. They even set up cemeteries. So if one of these Jewish employees died, they would have a proper Jewish place to be buried. And that's why when you go around Shanghai today, you see synagogues, you see until the Cultural Revolution, there was a Jewish cemetery. These were all built by the Sassoons and other Jewish families as part of kind of nurturing this pipeline of Jews who would come to work for these families and make their lives in Shanghai. So the Kadoories were one of these families, and Eli Kadoorie, who was the patriarch of the family, left home when he was only 15 years old to work for the Sassoons. He left his home in Baghdad, came to Bombay, was trained there, and then made his way to Hong Kong and then to north of Shanghai. Um, but he was 18 years old by then, very ambitious young man, and he realized he could make a lot more money working on his own, that working for the Sassoons was fine, but there was a lot more money to be made as an entrepreneur if he was on his own. Um, and so he went to Hong Kong and he began to invest in China Power and Light, he founded, and a number of other companies. But again, even though he worked very closely with the British never really accepted him. In fact, he kept on trying to get British citizenship, and the British kept on turning him down. And what that meant was that Eli Kadoorie, even as he became quite wealthy, had to be more creative. He had to work with Chinese businessmen, with Chinese capitalists. And that, in the end, ended up being a very smart thing, but again showed the kind of sense of being an outsider. And in fact, when I went through a lot of the documents to research this book, one of the things you see is the way the British talked about these two families. And they often had all these kind of criticisms and really bad comments about them. They would call them hook-nosed Jews. They would call them Jew boys, all these kind of slurs that people used against Jews. So on the one hand, they would do business with them, but as many of them would say, they would never want to socialize with them. Or even if they did, they always thought they were kind of not really people that they wanted to hang out with. So both of these families, the Sassoons through opium, the Kadoories through their investments in Hong Kong, become very wealthy and very powerful. The Kadoories go to Shanghai, where the Sassoons are as well, and really build up a huge real estate empire. They own, the tram lines. I mean, all throughout Shanghai, the Kadoories and the Sassoons are two of the most prominent families. And they really turned Shanghai in the 1920s and 1930s into one of the great cities of the world. Shanghai had always been a big city. It was always an important city for China. But in the 1920s and 1930s, it really becomes a world city like London or like Paris. And in fact, it's often called the kind of Paris of the East. And the center of all this is the Peace Hotel, which is still there on the Waitan. You can still go visit it. And actually today it's been restored. And so you can get a feel for what it was like. It was the most luxurious hotel in Asia. And at the very top, in a penthouse, Victor Sassoon kind of presided over his empire. Victor Sassoon was a really interesting fellow. Um, he was born in Europe and was a playboy. He was always seen with a chorus girl on each arm. He loved to drink wine. He really enjoyed being a very rich playboy. But during World War I, he was flying a fighter plane and it crashed, and he became crippled. He lost the use of his legs. He had to use crutches to get around for the rest of his life. And he became depressed, and he believed that he'd never be able to have the great social life that he had been looking forward to as a young man, because who would want to go out with a man who was crippled like that? So he moved to Shanghai to try to see if he could help the family business. And he turned out to be a brilliant businessman and invested all of the Sassoon wealth in Shanghai when Shanghai was booming. This was a very dramatic period when Shanghai was just a very vibrant political center, economic center, really very much like one of the world's great cities. And Victor Sassoon not only made a lot of money, but he enjoyed spending it. At the Peace Hotel, he would have these incredible costume parties where he would be the circus ringmaster, and everyone would have to dress up as a circus act. He would pretend to be the schoolmaster, and all the adult guests had to dress up as children. All sorts of celebrities would come to Shanghai to meet Victor Sassoon and to see how exotic it was. And in fact, one story I'll share: when I was doing the research for the book, I went to the Peace Hotel and I was being given a tour of Victor Sassoon's private apartment on top of the top floor of the hotel. And in his bathroom, there were two bathtubs. And I asked the man taking me around, I said, why are there two bathtubs in Victor Sassoon's bathroom? And he kind of got a little embarrassed and he said, well, Victor Sassoon always said he never minded sharing his bed, but he didn't like sharing his bath. So that gives you a feel for what it was like to be Victor Sassoon. He was a playboy. He was a millionaire many times over. Um, but also, I think what was important about both these families is that they broke a lot of the social barriers in Shanghai. They invited wealthy Chinese to their parties, to their dance parties. But even more importantly, they did a lot of business deals with not only the nationalists and people who were close to the nationalists, but with all sorts of entrepreneurs, capitalists, Chinese capitalists who were moving to Shanghai. Shanghai really became the economic center of China in the 1930s. And I think that while the Chinese capitalists understood capitalism and were very successful, what the Sassoons and the Kadoories brought was a sense of globalization. Their empires extended to Japan, to down to Hong Kong, to London, to India. And this was sort of an opening up of the world that I think many Chinese capitalists had not been fully aware of. And over again, there are these stories of Chinese capitalists kind of watching what the Sassoons and the Kadoories are doing, sometimes working with them, and discovering that there are ways to make money that go beyond China. And that they can be very successful. The Sassoons and the Kadoories brought in all sorts of new business techniques. They founded the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, for example, which becomes the most powerful bank in all of Asia. And also politically, both families are very influential. Ellie Kadoorie gets to know Sun Yat-sen. And in fact, when there's discussion of creating the state of Israel, which won't happen until after World War II, but early on, around 1920, Ellie Kadoorie meets with Sun Yat-sen and tries to get him to endorse a homeland for the Jewish people, because the Jews are always feeling that they're being attacked by different countries and have no place to call their own. And Sun Yat-sen writes a letter to Ellie Kadoorie saying, I sympathize with you. I want to support this because we Chinese now are being colonized in our own country, and we know what it's like to not have any power or influence. We support the Jewish people as they're trying to find a homeland as well. And then after World War II, Israel is created. So even early on, you see this connection between Jewish people and leaders of China who kind of recognize in each other certain common goals, certain common dreams. And in Shanghai in the 1920s and 1930s, as the Sassoons are becoming so rich, as the Kadoories are becoming so rich, they're dealing with Chiang Kai-shek and others, but also Mao Zedong, who moves to Shanghai in the 1920s. When he moves there, his landlord is a Jewish landlord. His landlord is one of these families that had worked for the Sassoons, became incredibly wealthy, and Mao and other revolutionaries are living in their apartments. But they also resent the fact that the foreigners have such influence in Shanghai, and that they're dominating so much of their country. So Shanghai, in a way, and the rise of Mao and the founding of the Communist Party is all taking place in Shanghai in this kind of cauldron of all these different groups that are coming together. And I think it's important to remember that because, again, it wasn't simple. It was a lot more complicated and complex than we realize. Now, starting in the late 1930s, I had already said that many foreigners were coming to Shanghai for business, or they were celebrities coming to meet with Victor Sassoon and stay in his beautiful hotel. But starting in the late 1930s, the cruise ships start bringing Jewish refugees, thousands of them, who are fleeing Nazism and the Germans. What's happening in Europe is that Germany is expanding, the Nazis have come to power, they're beginning to conquer the countries around them, including Austria. And the Jews are in a panic because they know the Nazis want to expel them. Eventually, the Nazis will try to kill them. But every other country in the world won't let these Jews in. You remember, as I keep on saying, Jews are often kind of targets of persecution and attack. And so, even when the Jews are facing this terrible fate that the Nazis have said they want to kill them all, the United States, Britain, all these countries refuse to let these Jewish refugees in, except for Shanghai. Because Shanghai is occupied, because the British and the Americans control part, the French control a part, the Japanese have been moving in. The nationalists have essentially retreated to Nanjing. There's really no functioning government in Shanghai. And what that means is that if you're a Jewish refugee, desperate to get out of Europe, terrified you're going to be killed, if you make it to Shanghai, you'll be safe because there are no visa requirements. And if you just get off the boat onto the Waitan, you'll be okay. And so the word of this spreads throughout Europe. And Jews, many of them middle class, upper middle class Jews who have some money, sell all their belongings and start buying tickets on these cruise ships. They're coming from Berlin, they're coming from Vienna, and they've just been told that if you make it to this place called Shanghai, you'll be safe. And so just imagine what it was like. I mean, they didn't speak any Chinese. They were musicians, professors, they owned stores. They were kind of had a very safe and prosperous middle class life. Suddenly, they're on a cruise ship and they're landing in Shanghai. No one speaks German, no one speaks English. There's incredible inequality on the streets of Shanghai. There are people, as we know, literally dying on the street. Shanghai is noisy, it's hot, it's humid. And these Jewish refugees are coming off, with their bags, with their families. And at this point, two things happen, which are quite remarkable. One is the Sassoons and the Kadoories, who are Jewish themselves, recognize that they have to do something. And so they begin to open up their office buildings, their hotels to these refugees to give them a place to stay. They start to employ them. And many of these Jews settle up in the Hangzhou neighborhood, where they can be safe. But the Hangzhou neighborhood also has a lot of Chinese there, and the Japanese are also kind of starting to occupy that neighborhood as well. And one of the things that the Jewish refugees write about in their memoirs or when I interviewed them is how nice the Chinese residents are to them. And this is really remarkable because for these Jews, remember, they were fleeing Germany and Austria, where many of their non-Jewish neighbors had turned against them. They had chased them down the street. They had humiliated them. They had turned them into the police. These Jews looked around and said, "We were friends and neighbors, but now you want to kill us." They come to Shanghai, and what happens is that even though they often cannot talk to their Chinese neighbors, the Chinese are nice to them. They give their kids rides in their rickshaws. They, teach the Jewish refugees how to cook. They help them with shopping. And over again, the Jewish refugees say, we couldn't really communicate, but they were nice to our family, and we found a way to live together. And when I spoke to the Chinese families about this, there was a sense the Chinese had that, they were being occupied by the Japanese. They were suffering terribly under Japanese occupation. And here they saw the Jews were also suffering, that they had had to flee their homeland. And so I think on a very human level, there was this connection that Chinese people and Jewish people made during World War II. And what's remarkable is that these 18,000 Jews, there's a huge number of Jews who come to Shanghai, none of them are killed during World War II. In fact, the Germans, the Nazis, come to Shanghai and try to persuade the Japanese to kill these Jews. And as we know from what happened in Nanjing and elsewhere, the Japanese had no qualms being brutal and killing people they didn't like. But again, the Jews are never hurt in Shanghai. And today, all around the world, there are these communities of Jews who were saved by Shanghai and look back very fondly on the city. And I think that's an important connection that Jews and the Chinese share. So after World War II, the Kadoories and the Sassoons returned to Shanghai, and they both believe that the parties will continue, and it'll still be a way to make millions of dollars, and that they can live their great colonial imperial life. But of course, as we know, the communists have other ideas. Mao and his forces surround Shanghai. They liberate it. And as 1949 approaches, both families flee Shanghai. Victor Sassoon, who's the head of the Sassoon family, leaves Shanghai. He actually gets a return ticket. He buys a return ticket, but he never returns. He settles in the Bahamas. He loses almost all his money. Almost the entire fortune is lost because it's mostly in real estate, not just the Peace Hotel, but all sorts of office buildings throughout Shanghai, a beer factory. Just about everything is lost. And Victor Sassoon actually becomes quite bitter, and he talks almost like a jilted lover. He says, I didn't leave China, China left me. And he never returns. The Kadoories are different, and in some ways they're smarter. They decide to go to Hong Kong, which is a British colony, of course, because they believe that at some point China will need them once again. And so they arrive in Hong Kong after the liberation. And again, for those of you who live in Hong Kong, this was kind of the lowest point of Hong Kong's history. The Japanese had occupied Hong Kong. They had virtually destroyed the city. So many people had died. Buildings had been destroyed. And the Kadoories become very involved in the rebuilding of Hong Kong. They are incredibly successful. And as we know, Hong Kong becomes a real economic success story. And the Kadoories are right at the center of that. But also, I think importantly, the Kadoories realize Horace and Lawrence Kadoorie, who are the sons who take over the empire. Their father had been one of the kings of Shanghai. He had lived in this huge mansion with 44 rooms and so forth. But they also realized their father had made a mistake. He hadn't seen the rise of the communists. He hadn't really recognized the terrible inequality and all the forces that led to the communists coming to power. He had lived in isolation. He lived in a bubble in this kind of colonial imperial life. And so his sons, who take over the family business, basically decide they're going to be more politically aware. And one of the things they do is they start the Kadoorie Agricultural Aid Association, which today is really known for the Kadoorie Farm and its environmental work. But in the 1950s, basically is helping Chinese refugees who are fleeing the communists and coming into Hong Kong. And these refugees are coming into Hong Kong. Often they have very little money. They're coming with their families, but they want to work. And so what the Kadoories do is they begin to work with the Hong Kong government to basically give these refugees small plots of land and pay for irrigation or tools so that they can begin to make a living. And they end up helping more than 300,000 Chinese refugees. Who flee China for Hong Kong and giving them almost these micro loans that enable them to kind of get back on their feet, maybe buy a few pigs, then use that as a start to try and rebuild their lives in Hong Kong. And in fact, the Kadoories also fund all sorts of research into pork because pork is such a central part of the diet of the Chinese citizens of Hong Kong. So the Kadoories fund all this research to help develop new strains of pig that will have produce more pork. And in fact, the Chinese joke often when I was in Hong Kong, they would say, the Kadoories know everything about the pig except what it tastes like because Jews don't eat pork. And so, but they're funding all this research. And so as a result, I think the Kadoories, while they're incredibly wealthy and while they, Lord Kadoorie, I mean, they're considered lords and they're knighted, also feel this connection to the people of Hong Kong, which is very important. And in 1978, when Deng Xiaoping comes back to power and the reform and opening begins, one of the first phone calls the Chinese leaders make is to the Kadoories in Hong Kong. And they ask them to come back to Shanghai. They ask them to invest again. And the first foreign investment and the biggest foreign investment at the time was when the Kadoories agreed to build the Daya Bay nuclear power plant. Now, again, I know there are concerns in Hong Kong about the environmental impact and so forth, but what's important to recognize is that 30 years after the Kadoories had fled Shanghai and the communists had chased them out, they were now being invited back in. They meet with Deng Xiaoping, they meet with other Chinese leaders, and really lead the kind of return of foreign investment into China. The Kadoories end up being involved in the negotiations for the handover. Um, Lord Kadoorie actually fights in Parliament to try to get more passports for Hong Kong citizens. He doesn't win, but he certainly tries to lead a fight. And the Kadoories today are incredibly influential, but also politically very important. They meet regularly with the Chinese leaders. They've met with Xi Jinping and others. And I think, frankly, like many people in Hong Kong, certainly many foreigners, certainly many businesses, they are uncertain about what is going on now and what all the changes in Hong Kong mean. But they're still very much at the center of Hong Kong's future. So I guess that as I conclude, and I'm looking forward to your questions, part of what I found so fascinating about this history was that it really is China's history, as well as the history of Jews, as well as the history of these families, that in ways that I think we don't fully appreciate in Shanghai and Hong Kong especially, Jews and other foreigners have been really at the center, not only as colonialists, which they were, or as imperialists, which they were, but also building connections to China and helping China develop. So history is complex, history is messy, but it's also fascinating. And for me, it was a great journey to discover, the history behind these families and the role they played in China's rise.
Cool. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor, for telling such remarkable stories of these two families, the Sassoons and the Kadoories, in such vivid details as well. And of course, summarizing the almost 200 years of legacies in around like 40 minutes. So yeah, I really like the fact that you draw the common experience between the Jewish and the Chinese communities abroad as well, as I also echoed the experience sometimes, as I also live a couple of years in the West. Now I'm based in Hong Kong, but Yeah. So yeah, thank you very much for the remarkable summary of these two families. So let me just kick off the Q&A with the first question. So, Professor, so how were you able to research information around 2,000 years ago regarding the Jewish history in Baghdad? How difficult was it to find primary sources to the piece of this book together, both about the families, but also from the Chinese perspective?
Right. Well, no, that's a great question. And, as you can tell, these were families that their empire spread all around the world. And so I did a lot of traveling. So for the Baghdad perspective, a lot of the papers and communications ended up in Israel. With a research museum and university there. So I spent a lot of time in Jerusalem going through the papers there. The Kadoories, most of their papers are in Hong Kong. The Kadoories have kept a family archive that they were very generous to share with me. And then for the Sassoons, I spent a lot of time in London because that's where a lot of their papers were kept. For the Chinese perspective, it was actually quite interesting. When the communists conquered Shanghai, they seized all the Sassoon business records. And I was able to see them and work with a Chinese researcher who went through them and was able to understand it. What I think is interesting now is that the archives in Shanghai kind of open and close sometimes, depending on the political feelings at the time. And so, 5 years ago, when I was able to start or do a lot of my research in China, things were pretty open and people could talk about it. That's closed down somewhat. But one thing that's quite interesting is that my book has now been published and translated into Chinese in Taiwan, but it's also going to be coming out in China. The Chinese Academy of Social Sciences is going to be translating it and publishing it. And so that says to me that there are people within China who are interested in this history. And when I would go to China and interview Chinese who had dealt with these two families, they were actually quite open and shared with me a lot of material, which was very useful. And I think especially in Shanghai, there is a fascination among Chinese who live in Shanghai about this history. They know that Shanghai had this incredible global, sophisticated history, and they're quite proud of it. But it's always been kind of hidden for them. And so even at the Peace Hotel, they've begun doing research. A number of researchers have begun looking into this. So I actually found that the Chinese in Shanghai were quite open and wanted to talk about this. And also, I would have these wonderful conversations at one point with a woman in Hong Kong, the daughter of a very wealthy capitalist family who had fled Shanghai for Hong Kong. She was 90 years old in a wheelchair, but she remembered going dancing with Victor Sassoon at the Peace Hotel. And so people's memories were still there about what Shanghai was like in the 1920s and 1930s. And of course, Hong Kong has a very large population that had come from Shanghai. And so a lot of those Shanghainese could talk about their experiences with both families.
Yeah. Yes, so the next question. Professor, you've mentioned how the Sassoons and the Kadoories built competing hotels, and how the Cathay Hotel was developed to overtake the Majestic Hotel. Was the rivalry between Victor Sassoon and Ali Kadoorie ever overtly expressed by the two men?
That's a great question. I don't think it was overt, but I think it was always there, in large part because the Sassoons were the kind of senior family. They were the wealthiest family. They had kind of been the most important family in Baghdad. And I think they always looked at the Kadoories as sort of the poor relations. They would help them out and so forth. And then I think the Kadoories kind of saw that they were eventually, especially after they moved to Hong Kong and the Sassoons left China, that they would overcome them. So at one point, the Sassoons were very influential in the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, and they always had a seat on the board. And in the 1950s, the Kadoories get that seat. It's kind of a symbolic way in which the Kadoories are now considered the most important Jewish family in Hong Kong. So I think while it was never explicit, there always was almost a kind of family, older brother, younger brother kind of relationship that developed. And I think today, in Hong Kong, people know the Kadoories, they don't really know about the Sassoons. Whereas, 100 years ago, it would have been the reverse.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so another question. Your book does a great job highlighting how the Kadoorie and Sassoon families shaped the history of Hong Kong and Shanghai. Could you perhaps comment on whether they are still relevant today? Do the two families continue to contribute to the current development of both Hong Kong and Shanghai now?
The Kadoories for sure. The Sassoons essentially left China after liberation, and they're now based primarily in London. And they're involved in actually Lord Sassoon, who's the leader of the family now, was in the British government. He was the economic minister. He now actually works for Jardine Matheson, which is kind of funny. And he's very much involved in some of their expansion inside China and meets with the Chinese leadership. But the Kadoories are very much influential. They are, as I said, the wealthiest family in Hong Kong. They own China Light and Power. They own the Peninsula Hotel chain. And they're consulted all the time by the Chinese government. I think what has changed is their position vis-a-vis the Chinese government, right? So when in the 1920s, 1930s, the foreigners in general, and the British especially, are on top, especially in Hong Kong, which was a colony. And so the Kadoories are part of that power structure. What's happened, since probably the 1980s, is that while the Kadoories are still the wealthiest family, Western family in China, they are much more beholden to the Chinese government. In a way, the tables have turned. And I think, like any Western company, it could be Apple, it could be Google, it could be Zoom. The All Westerners, all Western businesses understand they have to work with the Chinese government for their business. And I think that's true for the Kadoories too. And I think the family is very aware of their position. It's interesting, in all their time after 1949, the Kadoorie family never publicly criticized the party or the government in Beijing. Even during the Cultural Revolution, they never kind of said a word. And I think that was because the Kadoories always believed that at one point China would need to become global again. They would need to reach out. They would need Hong Kong as sort of an important part of China's future. But I have to say, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that they are nervous now. I often describe what they're doing as walking on a tightrope, because they probably half of their fortune is in Hong Kong and China. A huge amount of money, billions of dollars, billions of US dollars. And so they are very influential. They are very tied into the power structure in China, but they're also trying to figure out how do they make their way as all these changes are happening in Hong Kong and on the mainland as well. So I would say they are very influential, but like all Western businesses, they're trying to figure out what the future is going to bring.
Yeah, I definitely echo you with you, Professor, on that. On Kadourie's footprint in Hong Kong is still quite strong, especially given the Peninsula Hotel as well as I think some buildings in Repulse Bay, which is like the very wealthy areas in Hong Kong. So the next question is, Professor, what role do you think Victor Sassoon's disability played in his business ambition and personality?
That's a wonderful question. What's interesting about Victor Sassoon is that I don't know if maybe people like this. Some people, when they're disabled, their disability defines them. They kind of see themselves through their disability. Victor Sassoon had such a dramatic personality that it was almost like he denied he had a disability. When he would talk to you, people say it was like you were the only person in the room, and he would not, he was so focused on you. And the fact is, despite the fact that he was disabled, despite the fact that he used crutches, he was a womanizer. I mean, he had all these affairs with women, and he was just a kind of a magnetic personality. And so, it's interesting because I would talk to people and I would read these memoirs of people, and they would describe Victor Sassoon in the Peace Hotel holding one of his parties and, you know, having a girl on each arm. Then he would excuse himself to leave to go upstairs, and they would literally hear a thump as he fell. It was sort of embarrassing. And yet, no one ever wanted to say anything to him because he basically he didn't want to talk about his disability. So I think for him, it became a way, in a way, perhaps like being Jewish, right? There were these things that made life harder for him, being Jewish, being disabled, but he tended to turn them into fuel, fuel that he could use to kind of make even more money, charm even more people. And so he strikes me as that kind of personality, that whatever life threw at him, he tried to figure out how does he overcome it, or how does he use it to increase his ambition.
Great. The next question, what relationship did the Hadoons, as the third most important Jewish family, have with the Sassoons and the Kadoories?
Right. So the Hardoons were the third most important family. They had actually, Silas Hardoon actually began again working for the Sassoons and eventually broke off and became probably the individual who was the wealthiest man in Shanghai in the 1930s. They were kind of a complex family. Hardoon came to Shanghai and he married a woman who was European and Chinese, sort of, I think her mother might have been Chinese, her father was from Europe. So, what was interesting about that is that it helped Hardoon. It gave him insight in a business sense because she spoke Chinese, she spoke the Shanghai dialect, and these Jews from Baghdad didn't speak any Chinese. So she was able to help him kind of build his financial empire. They also, if in Shanghai today, if you know where that, I believe it's now a kind of trade center, but that it used to be the building for Soviet Chinese friendship in the middle of Shanghai, this kind of very Stalin like building. That was actually the site of the Hardoon estate with a huge, huge park around it. And Hardoon was incredibly wealthy. He and his wife never had children, but they adopted 12 children. Six of them they raised as Buddhist, and six of them they raised as Jews. It was a very odd kind of family. And Hardoon actually owned the building where Mao lived when he was in Shanghai. And I find it interesting. We don't know if Hardoon and Mao ever met. I doubt they did, but we just don't know. But we do know that in the 1950s, one of the first thing Mao did was to order the destruction of the Hardoon mansion, but to preserve the building, the little apartment where he lived, which you can see. It's near the Kerry Center in Shanghai. And I just thought, for Mao to basically say, we're going to preserve my apartment, but we're going to destroy my landlord's entire estate, had kind of an interesting sense of history to it. But what happened to the Hardoons was that when Hardoon died in the 1930s, all the children started fighting over his wealth and fighting over his will. And his wife was involved in all this. So in the end, the Hardoons actually lost most of their money because everybody was fighting over it and there was a huge legal fight. So the lesson to that is if you become wealthy and have a lot of children, make sure it's clear who gets what. Otherwise, it's all going to end up in court. And the Hardoons really just kind of sank beneath the waves because their fortune was all dissipated that way.
Right, in the interest of time, probably we can ask the last um, three questions. So you discussed briefly how Jewish people were viewed by the British colonialists at the time. And given this perhaps frightening dynamic, were the Kadoorie or Sassoons made members of the Hong Kong Club? And if so, how did they make it past the colonial gatekeepers?
Right. Well, let me talk first about the Shanghai Club, because the Shanghai Club was kind of the forerunner. And it was very British dominated, it was very colonial. Victor Sassoon was made a member of the Shanghai Club. Most other Jewish businessmen were not. And part of that was because Victor Sassoon was so wealthy, and he raced horses. He was his family. He was very close to Churchill. He was very close to the Prince of Wales. And even the snobs, the British snobs, thought, it was one of them said, it's hard to discriminate against someone who plays golf with the Prince of Wales. It was just his social position was so high. But occasionally, when Victor Sassoon would go to the Shanghai Club, these other British people would make fun of him behind their back. They'd go back to Baghdad, you camel driver. But again, Victor's way of dealing with that was just to ignore it. The Kadoories were not as well accepted, and in fact, Eli Kadoorie wanted to start a Jewish club in Shanghai for all the wealthy Jews. He was sort of angry about all this. And in Hong Kong, the Kadoories they did get into the Hong Kong Club and the Jockey Club, but again, it was always kind of because they were so wealthy. But there was always this sense that they were admitted late, and I don't think that they felt as much home there as they did with others. And so the Kadoories, in many ways, have carved out their own life. They have a very unique position in Hong Kong. They fund the synagogue there. You can see it in mid levels. They've been very generous to the Jewish community. But when you talk to them, there's a sense that they sometimes feel that they kind of have a foot in all these communities, right? They're Jewish. They have they have Chinese friends and people who work for them. They have the British, but it's almost like they're never fully at home in any of them. And I think they have a kind of a unique position, which is a very Hong Kong kind of position, right? In Hong Kong, you can live in sort of these different communities. And I think that's kind of what the Kadoories do.
Yep. So the second last question. So I think, Professor, you mentioned that slightly in your book already, and also in your presentation. So is there a specific reason why Sassoon chose to come to China, in particular during the 19th century?
Yeah, well, originally David Sassoon went to India and then made his way to China. And I think the reason was the British Empire, which was kind of arriving in India and then through the Opium Wars invaded China. The British Empire was really a commercial empire. They wanted business, they wanted money. They weren't as interested in China in conquering territory, right? Part of what when the Opium Wars were over, they wanted Hong Kong and they wanted access to Shanghai and to uh, uh, Guangzhou and other kind of trading ports. So it was really all about money for the British. And in that sense, the British needed people who would go ahead behind the British flag and do business. And so the Sassoons, because they had this great commercial background in Baghdad, because they were so good at trading, and I would argue because Jews had been kind of moving from place to place. Again, I think like the overseas Chinese, this was something Jews were good at. They knew how to set up trade. They knew how to do business the same way the overseas Chinese in Malaysia, knew how to do business when they got there. This was sort of the great opportunity that the Sassoons had. And after the Opium War, China had opened up. And so, it's almost like Silicon Valley in the United States. If you were young and ambitious, China was where you would go to make a lot of money. And so I think that was really what was going on, is that the British needed Jewish families and other immigrant families to kind of plant their flag in China from a business point of view. And the Sassoons took advantage of that.
Yeah, for the last question, so it's actually, for me being a host, probably take the last question. Like, this is the question from myself. So it's actually a quote from your book, Professor. So you also wrote, "Behind every great fortune lies a crime," in your book. Do you agree with that, or like
No, I do.
how
I
well,
think
yeah.
that I think the opium question is something that recurs over and over again, right? I think that um, people today, like for example, today, there's all sorts of criticism of Western companies in the United States, dealing with China, let's say, over their treatment of the Uyghurs or things like that. And so I think that businessmen are often faced with these moral dilemmas, but they often decide on a business basis, right? So, we as individuals may say, oh, well, opium is bad. I'm not going to deal with it, or I'm not going to, deal with Myanmar, let's say, because of the way they treat the Rohingya, or I'm not going to deal with, Donald Trump because I don't like the way he deals with immigrants. Business people tend to do things by can I make money or not, right? And I think that what happens to the Kadoories and the Sassoons, look, in some ways they were quite progressive, right? The Sassoons and the Kadoories both tended to pay their workers, their Chinese workers, more than other companies. They did, as I say, socialize with wealthy Chinese. The Kadoories did help the refugees in Hong Kong tremendously. But it's also true they were in a system, an imperialist system, that led to tremendous inequality. I mean, literally outside the mansion where the Kadoories lived, Chinese were dying in the street. And they just didn't see that, or they chose not to see it. So I think the idea of fortunes being built on a crime is really this question of how are you a moral businessman? In other words, is there a way you can make a lot of money, but also be moral? And I think China historically has always posed this challenge to many Westerners and many Western businesses, and probably also to Chinese businesses, but I'm looking at Western businesses. So I think we have to recognize that if you want morality, business may not be the place to look. So do you somehow have to regulate businesses to make sure they do or don't do things? But I think these families, they're complex. They did a lot of good, but they also did a lot of harm. And that's kind of that's the paradox we have to deal with, is that, what was the line that Deng Xiaoping once had about Mao being 70% good and 30% bad? I'm not sure how I feel about that, but I think all of history teaches us that these companies as well have good parts and bad parts, and we have to figure out what the moral balance sheet is, as well as the financial balance sheet.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Professor Jonathan Kaufman, for spending a wonderful 1 hour with us, Young China Watcher Hong Kong. And yeah, it's actually it was 8 a.m. in Boston right now. So thank you for thank you for spending your early morning with us. Audience, so please also check out our YouTube channel. So this event is being recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel. And please also go buy Professor's book if you haven't already. I know a lot of you have read it and are reading or will be reading, of course. And it is The Last Kings of Shanghai, the rival Jewish dynasties that helped create modern China. And last but not least, Professor, do you have a website or social media where people can follow you to follow your work?
Yeah, I'm not as active on social media as I should be, but it would be at Jonathan Kaufman 617. But if people want to get in touch with me, they can always email me. Just go to Northeastern University and look for my name, and my email will pop up, and I'll be happy to communicate with people.
All right. On that note, yeah, thank you very much for attending the event. Please stay tuned to our event as well. See you next time.